Eleanor Johnson woke up at 6:30 a.m., just like she did every Tuesday. The 78-year-old woman stretched her arms and looked out her bedroom window at the beautiful morning. The sun was just starting to shine on her rose garden outside. Another blessed day, Eleanor said to herself with a smile. She had lived in this house for 42 years. It was a nice two-story home with blue shutters in the quiet neighborhood of Oakwood Heights. Everyone on the street knew Eleanor. Before she retired, she taught second grade at the local elementary school for over 30 years. Many of her neighbors had once been her students. Eleanor got dressed in a pretty floral dress and her comfortable walking shoes. She made herself a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, then checked her calendar on the kitchen wall. Today she needed to buy groceries and visit the library where she volunteered twice a week. At the small kitchen table, Eleanor looked at the photos of her family. Her late husband, James, had passed away 5 years ago. Her son, Marcus, smiled from several pictures. Eleanor felt her chest swell with pride as she looked at the newest photo. Marcus in a suit, being sworn in as the United States Attorney General just 3 months ago. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered to the picture. By 10 a.m., Eleanor was ready to start her day. She grabbed her purse, a shopping list, and her car keys. Her blue sedan was 7 years old but still ran perfectly because Eleanor took good care of everything she owned. The grocery store was only 10 minutes away. Eleanor hummed along to the oldies station as she drove. At the store, she carefully selected fresh vegetables, some chicken for dinner, and her favorite peach ice cream as a treat. The cashier, a young woman named Tina, chatted with her as she bagged the groceries. "How's that son of yours doing in Washington, Mrs. Johnson?" Tina asked. "He's very busy, but he calls me every Sunday without fail," Eleanor replied with a warm smile. After shopping, Eleanor stopped at the library to return some books and help sort the new donation pile. The head librarian, Mrs. Watson, always said Eleanor was the best volunteer they had. Eleanor knew how to keep books organized better than anyone. It was almost 3 p.m. when Eleanor finally headed home. Her trunk was full of grocery bags, and she was thinking about the chicken recipe she would make for dinner. Maybe she would call Marcus later and tell him about the new roses blooming in her garden. As Eleanor turned onto Maple Street, just 1 block from her home, she noticed a police car parked near the corner. She didn't think much of it. Eleanor always followed the rules. She stopped completely at the stop sign, used her turn signal, and drove exactly at the speed limit. But as she made the final turn onto her street, Oakwood Drive, she saw flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. The police car was now behind her, signaling for her to pull over. "Oh my," Eleanor said, her heart suddenly beating faster. What could this be about? She carefully pulled her car to the side of the road, right in front of Mrs. Parker's house. Eleanor could see her neighbor peeking through the curtains, watching. Eleanor took a deep breath and did exactly what Marcus had always told her to do if stopped by police. She turned off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen, and waited. Her hands trembled slightly as she watched 2 officers get out of their patrol car in her mirror. The officers approached her car from both sides, their faces serious. Eleanor's peaceful day was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine. Eleanor sat very still in her car as the 2 police officers approached. The younger officer came to her driver's side window, while the older one stood on the passenger side, looking into her car. "License and registration," the young officer said sharply, without saying hello or explaining why he had stopped her. Eleanor noticed he didn't use ma'am or please. Her son Marcus had always taught her to be extra polite and careful around police. She wondered why this officer wasn't showing her the same respect. "Excuse me, officer," Eleanor said in her calm teacher voice. "May I ask why you pulled me over today?" The officer frowned at her. His name tag read Officer Miller. He looked about the same age as some of the new teachers at the school where she used to work. "You failed to use your turn signal back there," Officer Miller said, pointing behind them. "License and registration, now." Eleanor was confused. She always used her turn signal. It was a habit she had for over 50 years of driving. But she didn't argue. "Of course, officer. My license is in my purse. I'm going to reach for it now, okay," she said, moving her hand slowly toward her purse on the passenger seat. "Don't move so fast," Officer Miller suddenly shouted, putting his hand near his gun. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never been yelled at by police before. Her hands began to shake. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm just getting my license like you asked." The second officer, an older man with a gray mustache, was now shining a flashlight into her back seat, even though it was the middle of the afternoon and perfectly bright outside. "What's in all these bags?" he asked in a suspicious voice, pointing to her groceries. "Just my shopping, officer. I came from the grocery store," Eleanor explained. She carefully took out her license and the car registration she kept in the glove compartment. Her hands were still shaking as she handed them to Officer Miller. As he looked at her license, the officer's eyebrows went up. "You live on Oakwood Drive? In one of those big houses?" he asked, his voice full of doubt. "Yes, officer. I've lived at that address for 42 years, Eleanor replied. The second officer was now walking around her car, looking at it from all angles as if searching for something wrong. "This is a nice car for someone your age," he commented. "How do you afford this?" Eleanor felt her face grow warm. She knew what was happening now. Even at 78 years old, after a lifetime of working hard and following rules, she was being treated this way because of the color of her skin. "I bought this car 7 years ago when I retired from teaching," she explained patiently. "I've taken good care of it." Officer Miller handed her license back but kept her registration. "Step out of the car, please," he ordered. "May I ask why?" Eleanor said, her voice still polite but firmer now. "We need to check a few things," he said vaguely. "Step out of the vehicle." Eleanor noticed that Mrs. Parker was now standing on her front porch watching. Across the street, Mr. Wilson had come outside to get his mail, but he was clearly watching too. Other neighbors were appearing in windows and doorways. Eleanor felt humiliated. She had lived in this neighborhood longer than most of these officers had been alive. Everyone here knew and respected her. Now they were watching her being treated like a criminal, just 1 block from her own home. "Before I step out, I'd like to make a phone call, if that's okay," Eleanor said, reaching slowly for her phone in her purse. Officer Miller smirked. "Sure, call whoever you want. It won't change anything." The second officer chuckled. "Who you gonna call? Your lawyer?" Eleanor picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. As it began to ring, she took a deep breath and prepared to say words that would change everything. Eleanor held her phone to her ear as it rang. The 2 officers stood watching her with smirks on their faces. They clearly didn't think her phone call would matter. More neighbors had come outside now. Eleanor could see at least 5 people pretending to water plants or check their mail, all while watching what was happening. After 3 rings, a deep voice answered. "Hello, Mom. Is everything okay? You usually don't call me at this time." Eleanor spoke clearly so the officers could hear. "Hello, Marcus. I'm sorry to bother you when you're busy. I'm having some trouble near our house. 2 police officers have pulled me over, and they won't tell me clearly why. Now they want me to get out of my car." Officer Miller was still smirking, but the second officer's smile had faded a little. "Where exactly are you, Mom?" Marcus asked, his voice now serious and professional. "I'm on Oakwood Drive, just 1 block from home. Right in front of the Parker's house," Eleanor replied calmly. "Put me on speakerphone, please," Marcus said. Eleanor pressed the speaker button and held the phone where both officers could hear. "This is Marcus Johnson, United States Attorney General," the voice from the phone announced firmly. "Who am I speaking with, and why have you pulled over my 78-year-old mother?" The change in the officers' faces was instant and dramatic. Officer Miller's mouth fell open. The second officer straightened his back suddenly, as if someone had poked him. "Ah, this is Officer Miller and Officer Dawson with the Oakwood Heights Police Department," the younger officer stammered. "We pulled over the vehicle for a traffic violation." "What specific violation?" Marcus asked. "Failure to use a turn signal," Officer Miller said, but his voice didn't sound confident anymore. "I see," Marcus replied. "And why did you ask my mother to exit her vehicle for a simple turn signal violation? That's not standard procedure." The officers looked at each other. Neither seemed eager to answer. We were just being thorough," Officer Dawson finally said. Eleanor sat quietly, her hands still on the steering wheel. She didn't feel scared anymore. Now she felt sad that this kind of thing still happened, even in her own neighborhood where everyone knew her. Officers, please listen carefully, Marcus continued from the speakerphone. My mother has lived in that neighborhood for over 40 years. She has no criminal record. She's a retired school teacher. There is no reason to ask her to exit her vehicle for a minor traffic stop, if there was even a violation at all. Officer Miller shifted uncomfortably. Sir, we were just following. I'm not finished, Marcus interrupted. I'm going to stay on this call until this situation is resolved properly. Also, I'm contacting your police chief right now on my other line. Eleanor could hear Marcus typing on a keyboard in the background. Just then, both officers' radios crackled to life. Miller, Dawson, this is Chief Roberts. What's your current location? Over. Officer Dawson quickly grabbed his radio. We're on Oakwood Drive, sir. Over. Stay right there. I'm coming to your location myself. Do not leave the scene. Over, the chief's voice commanded. The officers' faces had completely changed now. Officer Miller handed Eleanor back her registration with shaking fingers. You're free to go, Mrs. Johnson. Sorry for the inconvenience, he said quietly. No, she's not going anywhere yet, Marcus said from the phone. My mother will stay right there until the chief arrives. This situation needs to be properly addressed. Eleanor looked around at her neighbors watching. Mrs. Parker had brought out a chair and placed it on the sidewalk nearby, showing her support. Mr. Wilson had walked closer and was standing with his arms crossed, keeping an eye on the officers. It's okay, Marcus, Eleanor said into the phone. I'll wait for the chief. I think this is important. In the distance, they could hear the siren of another police car approaching quickly. A police SUV with Chief written on the side pulled up behind the patrol car. A tall man in a crisp uniform stepped out. Chief Roberts was in his late 50s with short gray hair and a serious face. He walked quickly toward Eleanor's car. Mrs. Johnson? He asked, his voice much more respectful than the other officers. I'm Chief Roberts. I'm very sorry about this situation. Eleanor nodded. Thank you for coming so quickly, Chief Roberts. Marcus was still on speakerphone. Chief Roberts, this is Attorney General Marcus Johnson. I appreciate you coming personally. Of course, sir, the chief replied, looking uncomfortable. This is highly unusual and concerning. The chief turned to officers Miller and Dawson, who were now standing stiffly beside their patrol car. What exactly happened here? Officer Miller started to explain. We observed a traffic violation and... That's not true, interrupted a voice from nearby. Everyone turned to see Mrs. Parker walking toward them from her front yard. The 65-year-old woman pointed a finger at the officers. I was watering my flowers and saw the whole thing, Mrs. Parker continued. Mrs. Johnson used her turn signal. I've been watching this spot for years because teenagers often speed through here. Mrs. Johnson always drives carefully. More neighbors were gathering now. Mr. Wilson stepped forward too. I've known Eleanor Johnson for 30 years, he said. She taught my children. She's the most law-abiding person in this neighborhood. Chief Roberts looked back at his officers with a deep frown. Officer Miller stared at his shoes. We might have been mistaken about the turn signal, Officer Dawson admitted quietly. Then why did you stop her? The chief demanded. Neither officer answered. Eleanor spoke up in her calm teacher voice that had controlled classrooms for decades. Chief Roberts, I don't believe this was about any turn signal. I think we all know what it was really about. Everyone was quiet for a moment. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. When they saw an elderly black woman driving a nice car in this neighborhood, they made assumptions. Eleanor continued. They didn't see a retired teacher who has lived here for 42 years. They didn't see someone's mother or grandmother. They saw only the color of my skin. From the phone, Marcus spoke again. Chief, I'm sending a Justice Department official to take statements. They should arrive in about 20 minutes. In the meantime, I'd like to know what actions you plan to take about this incident. Chief Roberts nodded. I understand, sir. Officers Miller and Dawson are immediately placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. He turned to the officers. Turn in your badges and guns to Captain Lewis when you return to the station. The officers looked shocked. But Chief, Officer Miller started to protest. Not another word, the chief cut him off. Get back to the station. Now. The two officers walked back to their patrol car with their heads down. The neighbors watched silently as they drove away. Mrs. Johnson, I'd like to personally apologize for what happened today. Chief Roberts said. This is not how we train our officers to behave. I promise you, there will be consequences. Eleanor looked at all the neighbors who had come out to support her. Some were holding their phones, likely recording everything. Others stood with their arms crossed, watching protectively. Chief Roberts, Eleanor said, I don't want those young men to lose their jobs. Everyone looked surprised, including Marcus on the phone. Mom, are you sure? Marcus asked. Yes, Eleanor replied firmly. What I want is for them to learn from this. I was a teacher for 30 years. I believe in teaching, not just punishing. Chief Roberts looked at Eleanor with newfound respect. What do you suggest, Mrs. Johnson? Eleanor thought for a moment before answering. Her response would change everything. Everyone waited to hear what Eleanor would say. Even the neighbors had gone quiet, leaning in slightly to listen. Those officers need to understand what they did wrong, Eleanor explained. Firing them won't teach them anything. It might even make them angry and more likely to act the same way in their next job. Chief Roberts nodded slowly. I'm listening, Mrs. Johnson. I think they should spend time learning about our community, Eleanor continued. They should meet the people who live here, all the people. They should learn our stories. And they should have to talk to young black men and women about how it feels to be treated with suspicion for no reason. Marcus spoke up from the phone. Mom, that's a good idea, but there also needs to be official consequences. I agree, said Chief Roberts. What happened today was against department policy. Eleanor thought for a moment. Then how about this? The officers keep their jobs, but they have to do 3 things. First, they must take extra training about bias and proper procedures. Second, they must do community service here in this neighborhood for 6 months. And third, they must personally apologize to me, not because I'm the Attorney General's mother, but because I'm a citizen they treated unfairly. A black car with government plates pulled up behind the chief's SUV. A tall woman in a business suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase. Mrs. Johnson, I'm Sarah Chen from the Justice Department, she said, walking over. The Attorney General sent me to document what happened here today. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message. She looked down and saw it was from her son. Mom, you're amazing. I'm so proud of you. Let Sarah handle things now. Eleanor smiled at the message. Then she addressed everyone around her. I think we can turn this bad situation into something good. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Mrs. Parker patted Eleanor's shoulder. That's why everyone loves you, Eleanor. You always think of others. Chief Roberts looked relieved. Mrs. Johnson, if you're willing to work with us, I'd like to use this incident to create a new training program for our officers. Your suggestions could be the foundation. I'd be happy to help, Eleanor replied. But I'll need some time to recover from today first. Sarah Chen was taking notes on everything being said. Mrs. Johnson, would you be willing to make an official statement about what happened? The Justice Department is very interested in community policing improvements. Of course, Eleanor agreed. But can we do it tomorrow? I'd like to go home now. My ice cream is probably melting in the trunk. Everyone chuckled, and the tension in the air finally broke. Chief Roberts offered to escort Eleanor the rest of the way home and help with her groceries. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor noticed a young black family watching from across the street. They had recently moved into the neighborhood, and Eleanor hadn't had a chance to welcome them properly yet. She waved at them with a warm smile. The mother waved back hesitantly, holding her young son's hand. Chief Roberts, Eleanor said quietly, that's who we're really doing this for. That little boy shouldn't grow up afraid of the police, and the police shouldn't grow up afraid of him. The chief followed her gaze and nodded solemnly. As Eleanor finally drove the last block to her home with the police chief following behind, she thought about how differently this day had turned out than she expected. Her simple grocery trip had turned into something much bigger. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., her son Marcus was already working on turning this incident into national change. 1 week after the incident, Eleanor sat in her living room waiting for visitors. She had made her famous peach cobbler that morning, and the sweet smell filled the house. On the coffee table, she had set out her best china teacups and a pot of hot tea. At exactly 2 p.m., the doorbell rang. Eleanor smoothed her dress and walked to the door. Outside stood Chief Roberts, Officer Miller, and Officer Dawson. The two younger men looked nervous and uncomfortable in their civilian clothes. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Johnson," Chief Roberts said politely. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us today." "Please come in," Eleanor replied, opening the door wider. The three men followed her into the living room. Officers Miller and Dawson looked around the room with surprise. They saw family photos on the walls, including several of Eleanor with important people, one with a former president, another at her son's swearing-in ceremony as Attorney General. "Please, sit down," Eleanor said, gesturing to the couch. The officers sat stiffly while Chief Roberts took a chair. Eleanor poured tea for everyone. "Mrs. Johnson," Officer Miller began, his voice shaking slightly, "I want to apologize for how I treated you last week. There was no excuse for it." Eleanor looked at him carefully. "May I ask you something, Officer Miller? What were you thinking when you saw me driving in this neighborhood?" The young officer looked down at his hands. I guess I thought you didn't belong here," he admitted. "I'd assumed things I shouldn't have." "And what do you think now?" Eleanor asked. "I think I was completely wrong," Officer Miller said. "This is your home. You've lived here longer than I've been alive. I failed to see you as a person deserving respect." Officer Dawson spoke up next. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm sorry too. I followed along instead of speaking up when things didn't seem right. That's just as bad." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you both for your honesty. That's the first step toward real change." Chief Roberts handed Eleanor an official envelope. "This is the formal written apology from our department, Mrs. Johnson. We've also included the details of our new training program that we're developing with input from community leaders." Eleanor took the envelope but didn't open it. "What happens next for these officers?" she asked. "They begin their community service this weekend," the chief explained. "They'll be helping at the community center, meeting with local groups, and attending special training sessions twice a week." Eleanor turned to the officers. "The community center needs help with their after-school program for teenagers. I used to volunteer there myself. Those young people need good role models in uniform." Just then, Eleanor's phone rang. She checked the screen and smiled. "It's my son. Do you mind if I answer?" The officers looked nervous again but nodded. "Hello, Marcus," Eleanor said, putting the phone on speaker. "Hi, Mom. I just wanted to check if your meeting with the officers is going okay," Marcus asked. "Yes, they're here now," Eleanor replied. "They've apologized and Chief Roberts has given me the department's formal apology letter." "Good," Marcus said. "Chief Roberts, are you there?" "Yes, Mr. Attorney General," the chief answered quickly. "I want you to know that what your department does with this incident will be used as a case study for police departments across the country," Marcus explained. "My office is preparing a new set of guidelines for community policing, and we're watching how your department handles this situation." Chief Roberts sat up straighter. "We won't let you down, sir, or your mother." After the call ended, Eleanor served her peach cobbler. As everyone ate the delicious dessert, the atmosphere in the room slowly became less tense. "This is amazing, Mrs. Johnson," Officer Dawson said, taking a second helping. "My grandmother taught me how to make it," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "She always said food brings people together better than anything else." As they ate together, the first small steps toward understanding had begun. 3 months passed since the day Eleanor was stopped by the police. It was now summer, and the community park was filled with people enjoying a special event. Colorful tents and booths lined the walking paths. Children played games on the grass while adults chatted in groups. A large banner hung over the entrance: Oakwood Heights Community Unity Day. Eleanor sat under a shady tree, watching everything with a smile. This event had been her idea, part of the program she helped create after the incident. Beside her sat Mrs. Parker and several other neighbors who had formed a community committee with her. "Eleanor, I can't believe how many people came today," Mrs. Parker said, looking around at the crowd. "It's wonderful," Eleanor agreed. "Look over there." She pointed to a booth where Officer Miller and Officer Dawson were helping children decorate cookies. The officers wore casual clothes with small badges that said Community Helper. Children crowded around them, laughing and talking. In another area, Chief Roberts was giving a presentation to a group of teenagers and parents about how to safely interact with police. He showed them what to expect during a traffic stop and answered many questions from the audience. Mrs. Johnson? Eleanor looked up to see the young mother from across the street standing nearby with her son. Eleanor had learned their names were Tanya and Jamal. The family had moved to the neighborhood just a month before the incident. Hello, Tanya. Hello, Jamal. Eleanor greeted them warmly. Are you enjoying the event? Yes, very much, Tanya replied. I wanted to thank you. Before what happened to you, I was afraid to let Jamal play outside in this neighborhood. I wasn't sure if we belonged here. Jamal, who was about 7 years old, nodded. Now I know Officer Miller. He taught me how to play chess at the community center. Eleanor patted the bench beside her. Please, sit with me for a while. As they sat together, Tanya explained how things had changed for our family. When we first moved here, none of the neighbors talked to us. After what happened with you and those officers, everyone started introducing themselves. Mrs. Parker brought us a welcome basket. Mr. Wilson invited my husband to join the neighborhood watch. That's exactly what we hoped would happen, Eleanor said. Sometimes it takes something difficult to bring people together. Across the park, a car pulled up and a tall man in a suit stepped out. Eleanor's face lit up when she saw him. Marcus, she called, waving to her son. The Attorney General walked over, stopping to shake hands with people who recognized him. When he reached Eleanor, he gave her a warm hug. Sorry I'm late, Mom. The meeting in Washington ran long, Marcus explained. You're here now, that's what matters, Eleanor replied. She introduced him to Tanya and Jamal. Marcus knelt down to Jamal's level. Nice to meet you, young man. Are you having fun today? Jamal nodded excitedly. Yes, sir. And I'm going to be an attorney general when I grow up, just like you. Everyone laughed, and Marcus smiled. That's a wonderful goal. As the afternoon continued, Marcus walked with his mother through the park. They stopped to watch Officer Miller demonstrating proper basketball techniques to a group of teenagers. You know, Mom, Marcus said quietly, what you did here is spreading. 5 other police departments have adopted similar community programs. The Justice Department is using your story as an example of how to turn a negative incident into positive change. Eleanor squeezed her son's hand. I'm proud of what we've accomplished, but there's still more work to do. Yes, Marcus agreed. But thanks to you, thousands of police officers will receive better training, and communities across the country will benefit. Eleanor looked around at her neighbors enjoying the day together, people of all ages and backgrounds talking, laughing, and getting to know each other better. This, she said, gesturing to the scene before them, is what justice really looks like. 1 year had passed since the day Eleanor Johnson was wrongfully stopped by the police. It was a cool autumn afternoon, and Eleanor sat in the front row of the Oakwood Heights Community Center. The room was filled with people, neighbors, police officers, reporters, and visitors from other cities. On the stage, a podium was set up with a banner that read, The Eleanor Johnson Community Policing Initiative, 1-year anniversary. Chief Roberts stood at the podium, addressing the crowd. When Mrs. Johnson was mistreated by our officers a year ago, she could have demanded harsh punishments. Instead, she chose education and understanding. Today, we celebrate the incredible changes her wisdom has brought to our community. Eleanor smiled as she listened. Beside her sat officers Miller and Dawson, now wearing special badges that identified them as community relations officers. They looked very different from the men who had stopped her car a year ago. They sat tall and proud, truly part of the community now. Chief Roberts continued. Traffic stops involving our officers have increased in politeness and decreased in complaints by 78% this year. Crime in our neighborhood has dropped by 22% because people trust the police enough to report problems and work with us. The crowd applauded. Eleanor noticed Jamal and his family sitting a few rows back. Jamal waved excitedly to her, and she waved back. And now, Chief Roberts announced, it is my great honor to introduce the United States Attorney General, Marcus Johnson. Marcus walked onto the stage as everyone stood and applauded. He hugged Chief Roberts before taking the podium. Thank you all for coming today, Marcus began. As many of you know, this program started because 2 police officers made a mistake with my mother. But my mother, being the teacher she's always been, turned that mistake into a learning opportunity. The crowd nodded and murmured in agreement. Today, I'm proud to announce that the Justice Department is launching the Eleanor Johnson Initiative nationwide, Marcus continued. This program will provide funding and training for police departments across the country to implement the same community policing methods that have been so successful here. Everyone applauded again. Eleanor felt tears in her eyes as she looked around the room. Mrs. Parker reached over and squeezed her hand. And now, Marcus said, I'd like to ask the person who made all this possible to come up here, my mother, Eleanor Johnson. The crowd stood and cheered as Eleanor slowly made her way to the stage. Marcus helped her up the steps and gave her a warm hug before letting her take the podium. Eleanor looked out at all the faces watching her, young and old, black and white, civilians and police officers, all together in one room. When I was stopped that day, Eleanor began in her clear teacher's voice, I was afraid. Even at 78 years old, with a lifetime of being careful and following rules, I still felt afraid. That's something many people in our community have felt for generations. The room was completely silent as everyone listened. But fear can't be the foundation of community, she continued. Trust must be, and trust has to be built through understanding. That's what we've been building here. Understanding. She smiled at Officers Miller and Dawson in the front row. These officers made a mistake, but they learned from it. We all learned from it. And now, communities across the country will learn from it too. Eleanor paused and looked at her son standing proudly beside her. My late husband used to say that true change doesn't come from big speeches or new laws alone. It comes from people willing to sit down together, look each other in the eye, and really listen. That's what we did here in Oakwood Heights. As Eleanor finished her speech, the crowd gave her a standing ovation. Reporters took pictures and wrote notes for their stories that would be shared nationwide. Later, as Eleanor walked out of the community center with Marcus, a young police cadet approached her. Mrs. Johnson, the young woman said, I just wanted to tell you that your story is why I decided to become a police officer. I want to serve my community the right way. Eleanor smiled and took the young woman's hand. That, she said gently, is the greatest gift you could give me.